program is provided without charge by Reformed Theological Seminary, which reserves all rights. To learn how you can support RTS, please visit give.rts.edu.
Okay, let's move on to the second category here, which is Apocryphal Acts. Obviously, in the canon, we have the book of Acts, which is known as the Acts of the Apostles. And what's interesting about the canonical Acts, of course, is that even though it's the Acts of the Apostles, fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's really Paul, right? At the beginning, it references Peter, too, a little bit, and then some other apostles a little bit. But when the ball gets rolling in Acts, it's Paul. As you might imagine, then, there's other Acts that start popping up. And a lot of these Acts try to highlight the lives of other apostles that aren't covered there. And then some of them still try to do Paul, but embellish it. So again, apocryphal texts tend to sort of fill in the gaps left by the canonical text. As I said yesterday in the lecture, apocryphal Acts are interesting because they're very much an adventure story, kind of like an ancient Hellenistic novel. In fact, scholars have argued that they actually are patterned after ancient Hellenistic novels, which are sort of this grand adventure with your hero, and there's usually a romance. And the romance aspect is tweaked a little bit in the Christian version, and it's not so a romance with another human, but a romance with God, right, with Jesus, with wanting to be loyal to him, and so on. And so the Apocryphal Acts are fascinating. There's a whole bunch of these. I'm just going to mention 3 of them that are dated to probably before the end of the 2nd century, so before the 200 A.D. And the first is the Acts of John. Now, the Acts of John is obvious why they would do that, because the Acts of John is like, well, John didn't get his fair shake in the first version, right? So someone wants to go back and fix the Acts by giving John his due. So this particular Acts focuses on the city of Ephesus, no surprise, and sort of catalogs the deeds and activities of the Apostle John, as opposed to the canonical Acts, which really focuses instead on Peter and really Paul, as I've already indicated. So you can see how someone read the canonical Acts and think, well, John didn't get much attention at all, and maybe he should be. One of the things that makes the Acts of John interesting is these sensational stories. All of them have sensational stories. The most famous one in the Acts of John is the scene of the bed bugs. Okay? You're thinking, what in the world? So John is trying to sleep in this room. He's on the road. He's on his journey. And these bed bugs are tormenting him at night while he's sleeping. So John stands up and rebukes the bed bugs and orders them out of the room so he can sleep. And the next morning, when they come to wake up John, the apostle, in the room, the observers see all these bugs outside the door, having been banished from the room, waiting to get permission to get back in. So, of course, John wakes up now with a good night's sleep and says to the bugs that they can now resume their former activities, and off they go. It's a bizarre book of Acts. This is standard fare. What's interesting about the Acts of John is it's very much Gnostic. It's sort of this proto-Valentinian style book, and it has a Christology that's very docetic, right? Jesus isn't really human, just seems to be human, and so on. So you can see why the church found the Acts of John to be really bad. Now, not all Acts are bad, or what I should say is not all Acts are unorthodox. There's also the Acts of Paul. And technically, it's the Acts of Paul and Thecla. But sometimes it's just shortened as the Acts of Paul. The Acts of Paul, again, 2nd century Acts. You think, well, didn't Paul get enough attention in the first one? Yeah, but the hero of the Acts of Paul isn't Paul. The hero of the Acts of Paul is a woman named Thecla. Thecla is a famous female convert who is engaged to be married, meets Paul, comes to Jesus, leaves her fiancé, and journeys on the way with Paul as a missionary, and performs all kinds of amazing deeds. Now, the Acts of Paul became famous in early Christianity because people really liked the idea of Thecla being famous. So it's like this famous woman who got a highlight. We don't have a lot of women in these accounts that get a lot of sort of airtime. And so Thecla was famous female hero alongside Paul. We see this actually in 2nd century Christianity. A lot of the martyrdom accounts are about women, and the Acts of Thecla ends up being about this. What's interesting is the way that it's appealed to by other writers later. Some people writing later look at the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and the church fathers saying, wow, people are using this to justify women pastors or women doing baptisms. Apparently in the book, Thecla baptizes herself. Okay? And so not only does she baptize herself, which is odd, but now you've got a female doing baptisms, which certainly wouldn't have been standard practice then. And so this creates a little bit of a rustle, and Tertullian later kind of complains about it. He's like, this book is causing trouble, right? So the Acts of Paul and Thecla are a little bit of an irritant to him. A couple other things about the Acts of Paul I think are worth noting. First of all, it's orthodox. And when I say it's orthodox, what I mean is it doesn't have all the heretical tendencies that you would expect to have. The only thing you could say about the Acts of Paul that might be borderline problematic is that it's very ascetic in its mentality, okay? And of course, asceticism was on the rise now, which is the idea of don't get married, sexual activities, even something you should avoid in marriage, very ascetic, kind of restrain your all sensual pleasures in life completely type movement in early Christianity. And so that was kind of on the rise here. And you pick that up in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, right? Because Thecla says, I'm not going to get married to my fiancé. I'm going to get married effectively to Jesus. Go and be a missionary. The other thing to note about the Acts of Paul and Thecla is it was forged by an Orthodox individual. We have accounts later of this individual getting caught in his forgery of the Acts of Paul. Now, technically, it wasn't a forgery. It was a fabrication. Now, there's no difference between a forgery and a fabrication, right? Forgery is when you pretend to be an author you're not. There's no name attached to the Acts of Paul and Thecla, so the guy technically wasn't trying to pretend he was Paul. But he did write a fabrication, meaning he made up stories about Paul that weren't true. Now, when the church found out that this guy had done this, I think he might have even been a presbyter. I can't remember the exact details. They did not say, well, that's okay. As long as you meant well, we're not worried about such things because, we Christians don't really care about, whether books are true or not. It's just a matter of whether God can speak to them. Now, notice that's not what the answer was, right? When they found out that a guy had forged it or fabricated it, they condemned him. This just fits what we said earlier in the class, right, about pseudonymity and that sort of thing. Christians did not think that was valid. The final thing I'll mention about the Acts of Paul is that embedded within it, and this is jumping the gun a little bit, is 3 Corinthians. So this really belongs up here under epistles. So you have kind of a quasi-mixed genre. See, so you know how in the real Acts, there's letters embedded in the real Acts? And they think about the letter in the Jerusalem Council they wrote. That was sort of the Acts with an embedded letter. Okay, well, they did this in the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And the embedded letter was the 3 Corinthians letter, which wasn't heretical, but it was obviously not from Paul. And 3 Corinthians has kind of gotten famous because of this, but we know it was faked, if you will, and wasn't really his letter. So this is interesting observation. I'll say a few things about 3 Corinthians. It basically focuses on the theme of creation. It deals with the issue of whether Jesus came in the flesh and whether there'll be a resurrection of the body or a resurrection of the flesh. And it's saying yes to both things. Jesus did come in the flesh, and Jesus is promising that we'll be resurrected in the flesh. This is 3 Corinthians. Now, incidentally, you and I hear that and go, that's great, right? We were for that. And what did I say? I said 3 Corinthians and the Acts of Paul are pretty much orthodox. So you can see what's going on. The Acts of Paul and 3 Corinthians was probably written by an orthodox person trying to battle heresy. And it's obvious here that the enemy is trying to fight is Docetism, right? This idea that Jesus didn't come in the flesh, that Jesus just seems to be human. So the Acts of Paul is a good example of an orthodox work that was still fabricated. And pausing on this for a moment, this is a sticky thing, okay? When you see apocryphal works that are heretical, it's easy to dismiss them and go, well, that's what heretics do. They fake things and lie. Of course it's heretical. Be gone. But here's an awkward reality, is that some people in the early church who were orthodox fabricated and faked things in order to fight heresy. So some of the anti-heresies were also lies. Can you lie in the cause of defending truth? Well, some Christians did that. Okay. Now, we just need to, at this point, realize that happened. We think that book doesn't belong in the canon. When the Christian church discovered what it was, they condemned it, and on, fair enough. But what you need to realize is that sometimes that happened. Sometimes even the Orthodox Christians did things they shouldn't have done in order to bolster their cause, which is unfortunate. The last Acts I'll mention here is the Acts of Peter. The Acts of Peter, as you might imagine, catalogs the life of Peter, and it starts off in Rome. So just like the Acts of John starts off in Ephesus, the Acts of Peter starts off in Rome. And again, Peter got some attention in the first Acts, but not a lot. And it focuses mainly, as the Acts title suggests, on Peter himself. Remember when I said yesterday that there was a lot of apocryphal literature associated with Peter in the 2nd century? Gospel of Peter, the preaching of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Acts of Peter. This is why, no doubt, 2nd Peter had its rough patch, okay? People are like, we're a little wary of this Petrine pseudonymity fact that is around. We want to make sure that anything that has Peter's name attached to it that we're a little wary of. So you can see why it might have taken a while for people to sort of be reassured. The Acts of Peter is itself highly embellished. There's a famous scene where he battles the heretic Simon Magus. And what's interesting is that Simon begins to fly above the city of Rome, no doubt elevated by his demonic loyalty. So here's the flying heretic, Simon Magus. And so Peter then prays that this Simon would crash to the ground. And of course his prayer is answered, and Simon does. There's also the baptizing of a lion in the Acts of Peter, which is rather odd. I mean, we don't really have any examples of animals being baptized, but hey, why not? So there's a baptized lion, there's a talking dog, there's a flying heretic, Simon Magus. You can see where all this is going. It's a bizarre book. But most notably, the Acts of Peter includes a scene where Peter is crucified in Rome, upside down. There's speculation about how accurate that is. We don't know. There's other traditional comments in early Christianity that he was killed in Rome, crucified upside down. So the thought is that this does tap into maybe something that's authentic about what happened to Peter. So the Apocryphal Acts are quite entertaining. And, and they're long, too. If you go and you check out a book that gives you all the New Testament Apocrypha, by the way, if you're wondering, where can I get all these texts? There's books, right? The most famous is a book called the New Testament Apocrypha by a guy named J.K. Elliott. Literally wrote the book on the New Testament Apocrypha, right? It's called the New Testament Apocrypha, and he includes all of these, pretty much. There's a few exceptions he doesn't include, and he does additions, all that. On to the epistles. The apocryphal epistles, what's interesting about these, and now we're back up, kind of went out of order here, I know. The apocryphal epistles, interestingly, were very rare in early Christianity. Now, of course, there's a difference between apocryphal epistles and so-called pseudonymous epistles, right? So the critics would say, well, apocryphal epistles might be rare, but there's tons of pseudonymous ones. 2 Peter, even maybe 1 Peter, Colossians, Ephesians, the pastorals. These are all faked, right? So in one sense, they would probably stick those here. We would, of course, disagree with that. And when you start looking around, there's not a lot of these. 3 Corinthians is one. Let me just mention another one. That is the epistle to the Laodiceans. I already mentioned that there's a hint at the end of Colossians that Paul maybe sent a letter to the Laodiceans, which of course we don't have. And so there's speculation that maybe someone decided to write it. And they did. Somewhere in the 2nd century, someone wrote what's called the Epistle to the Laodiceans. Now, when you look at the Epistle to the Laodiceans, it's clearly a pastiche of other Pauline letters. Largely Galatians and Philippians and some other places, they just kind of patch it together, and it's obviously a production that's designed to sort of mimic other Pauline letters. What's interesting, though, is that this was quickly sussed out by early Christians, so much so that in the Muratorian fragment, remember the Muratorian fragment, the Muratorian canon lists the books received, but also the books rejected. One of the books rejected was the Epistle to the Laodiceans. So it's clear that in the early church, they weren't buying it. They knew it was not a production of the real Paul, and they rejected it. That tells you something, by the way, which I brought up earlier. I got to say it again here. All the disagreement about stuff like this, you realize the church would have been on its game in terms of analysis of these texts. You should be encouraged that they were able to suss that out, right? They were able to look carefully at that, which means they weren't willy-nilly accepting everything. And it wasn't just this pristine process where they just say, yeah, okay, everybody get in and we're done. No, they were able to sort of sift and look and analyze, and that takes time, but that should be encouraging for us. Now, the other thing to note about epistles, so you got 3 Corinthians and Laodicea here. This is the two main ones. But I'm going to mention another category of epistle, and it's not the one you might expect. What's interesting is that a number of apocryphal works were in the form of a letter, They were in the form of an epistle, even though they were something else. Okay? And I'll give you a couple examples of this. One is a letter called the Epistle of the Apostles, or the Epistula Apostolorum in Latin, the Epistle of the Apostles. This was a very, very popular book in early Christianity, the Epistle of the Apostles. And it's in the form of a letter. So you can kind of stick it here, genre-wise. It seems to be a letter from the apostles about Jesus. Okay? So you got a letter from the apostles, which you'd pay attention to if it was really from them. But what's interesting is that as the letter goes on, the apostles are simply in this letter recounting teachings of Jesus. And as they recount teachings of Jesus, it morphs into sort of an apocalypse. It mainly tells about post-resurrection teachings of Jesus about the end of the world, the second coming, the resurrection of the body, the incarnation, and so on. And so it's a letter from the apostles about Jesus, but then it starts quoting Jesus so much, it just turns into a post-resurrection account of teachings of Jesus that are about the end of the world. So it's sort of letter form, but apocalyptic content. Interestingly, the Epistle of the Apostles is pretty anti-Gnostic. So it's fighting Gnosticism, which is obviously a good thing, but again, it's no doubt a fabricated text. Let me mention another example of a similar letter, and that is something called the Apocryphal of James. The Apocryphal of James, sometimes called the Letter of James. This also was discovered at Nag Hammadi along with the Gospel of Thomas. And it presents itself as a letter from James, the Lord's brother. Okay, so think about the James who wrote the Epistle of James in our canon. Here's another letter from that James. James, the Lord's brother, remember I told you he's very famous in early Christianity. He supposedly wrote another letter, and here it's called the Letter of James, also known as the Apocryphal of James. However, again, this letter doesn't stay a letter. What does it do? It morphs into, yes, again, a recounting of all that Jesus said after his resurrection to James. So think about it. James is saying, I'm the brother of Jesus, and when Jesus rose from the dead, he told me all these things. Here's what he told me. Okay. So is it a letter? Yes, but it's also a post-resurrection dialogue about what Jesus said. So it's kind of a letter, but it's also kind of one of these dialogue gospels up here, or post-resurrection kind of gospels. And so it's this morphed kind of genre. You don't really know what to do with it. But as you can expect, because this is a document that was found at Nag Hammadi, it's very Gnostic. And what does the Jesus and his post-resurrection dialogue tell James? Oh, salvation comes from knowledge, comes from gnosis. Well, real surprise, right? And so he's trying to sort of force his teachings on the church as a result. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there in the Epistle of the Apostles, and then, as I said, in the Apocryphal of James that are worth noting. By the way, if you look at the board here, there's a lot, right? I mean, look at all the stuff flying around. You can see that Christians were prolific producers of literature, and this is one of the things that we see them doing here. So, if you're ever looking for a good doctoral dissertation topic down the road, pick something in the apocryphal literature world because there's tons of options, right? Plenty to write on. All right, let me look at the last category here of apocryphal literature, and that is apocalypses. Yes, indeed. It wasn't just letters and Gospels and Acts that were written after the fact, but also the final category of apocalypse. Of course, apocalypse is the apocalyptic genre we find in places like the book of Revelation. And that type of genre was known to early Christians, not only through Revelation, but through Old Testament books like Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah, and also through intertestamental books like Enoch and Ezra, or what's called Fourth Ezra, and so on. Okay, so what are a couple examples of Christian apocalypses? I'm just going to give you two here. The first is known as the Ascension of Isaiah. The Ascension of Isaiah is an oddity because it's actually about an Old Testament figure. What this particular document does is catalogs prophetic visions given to the prophet Isaiah. And so it kind of goes back in time, so to speak, and says, hey, here's some things that God told Isaiah when he was a prophet. So additional visions that aren't in the book of Isaiah that are recorded here. And Isaiah is given a chance to go up into the heavenlies. Remember how John in the book of Revelation is taken up into heaven and sees visions? Same thing happens to Isaiah. So Isaiah is taken up into the heaven and seen visions. And what does he see? He sees visions about the coming of the Messiah, the coming of Jesus. Now, this is a little bit of an odd apocalyptic book because most apocalyptic books we know of are about New Testament figures or in the New Testament era, but also most apocalyptic books are about the end of the world. Not the ascension of Isaiah. The ascension of Isaiah is actually about the first coming of Jesus, not the second. So in that sense, it's a little bit of an odd apocalypse, admittedly. Maybe not your normal one. The other apocalypse, as you might guess, is the apocalypse of Peter. Now, the apocalypse of Peter was that apocalypse that was sort of on the bubble in the Muratorian fragment, okay? Sort of like, well, some people accept this, some don't kind of take on the apocalypse of Peter. So what is the apocalypse of Peter? You're going to think that this was a broken record, but it was another post-resurrection dialogue between Jesus and Peter on the Mount of Olives. Just noting that for a moment, the fact that so many of these apocryphal writings put this post-resurrection dialogue feature in just tells you something. They're looking for some place to shove their gospel that's believable. Oh yeah, Jesus was around for 40 days after he rose from the dead. He must have taught a lot. Well, here's one of the things he taught, that kind of thing. So Peter and Jesus are hanging out on the Mount of Olives after the resurrection. And Jesus says, look, I'm going to give you a vision of the future. This is a sort of like John got, but now Peter got this one. And the apocalypse of Peter is known for its extremely graphic depictions of hell. The severe judgments that the wicked will endure, even sort of uncomfortably gory details about what the wicked will endure in hell. There's speculation that, and we don't know this for sure, but there's speculation that the apocalypse of Peter actually influenced later art and literature in the medieval time period, particularly because of its graphic depictions of hell. Dante's Inferno, which is about all the layers of hell, is said to have had influence from the apocalypse of Peter. Don't know if that's true or not. Regardless, it was very, very sort of a bold graphic presentation and was popular amongst early Christians, at least enough, as I mentioned, to kind of be on the bubble in the Muratorian fragment. As a side note, there's also another apocalypse of Peter in early Christianity that was discovered at Nag Hammadi. So, you'd think they'd come up with two names here, but the problem is the documents are both called this. So there's the apocalypse of Peter we're talking about here with all the descriptions of hell, but then there's another apocalypse of Peter, same name, discovered at Nag Hammadi in Coptic, this one, not Greek, that is totally bizarre and not one we're going to talk about here. Okay, there's our whirlwind tour of what we're talking about here when it comes to apocryphal materials. One figure that we've only briefly mentioned up till now, but we need to talk about him, is Marcion. So I'm just going to give a little mini lecture on Marcion. I'm going to talk about the person. I'm going to talk to the Marcionites. I'm going to talk about the canon of Marcion. All right, so let's start with Marcion himself. There's probably no figure in early Christianity, on the heretical side at least, that stands out more than Marcion. Marcion is considered not only the first heretic of any significance, Simon Magus technically before him, but there's a little bit of a mystery around the legitimacy of his own actions. But the first real heretic was Marcion. And he was one of the most influential figures in the 2nd century and beyond. And so he is considered not just a heretic, but maybe the arch-heretic, maybe the ultimate heretic, sort of the consummate poster child of heretic. If you look up heretic in the dictionary, you have a picture of Marcion, right? He is that guy. What we know about Marcion is very little, but let me just tell you what we know about him. Apparently he was a wealthy shipbuilder. He was a ship owner, shipbuilder, wealthy merchant who made his way to Rome around 140 to 144. And by that time, the Roman church was, blossoming. It was growing. It was a significant influence. And he got connected with that Roman church of Christians. But not only did he become a part of it, he made an enormous financial gift to the church, a huge sum of money. Now, it wasn't long after that, now that he had a newfound standing in the church due to his own financial abilities, that he ended up advocating a system of thinking that was completely contrary to anything the church had ever really heard before up to that point. We don't know where Marcion came from. There's all kinds of, rumors in early Christianity that his father was a bishop, but that doesn't seem likely. So we don't really know what happened to him prior to this, and we really don't even know what happened after he was excommunicated. He was basically booted, as we'll see, for his heretical views. So we're trying to piece together Marcion's belief system across a number of different places in early Christianity. It's not always easy to do that. But here's the essence of his view, okay? And this is moving on to his view, and you could say Marcionites or Marcion's views. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether, when you get a view, whether it's Marcion's or whether it's his followers, okay? This is a common problem, by the way. Sometimes the founder of something has one view, and then his disciples go kind of nuts, and then you associate their crazy view with the founder. In this instance, I don't think there's that disparity, but again, we just have to make our statements qualify because we don't know. But Marcion's theology was shaped by a fundamental premise, and that is he had an insurmountable objection to the Old Testament. He viewed the God of the Old Testament as vengeful and wrathful. And he viewed Jesus as none of those things. He saw Jesus as peaceable, merciful, and loving. Old Testament, God was strict and rigid. Jesus was warm and inviting. So he saw two diametrically different systems, or systems that were diametrically opposed, probably a better way to say it, when you looked at the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, thus he drew a conclusion from this. His conclusion that he drew, which in one sense is sort of shocking but kind of obvious, is he concluded that the God of the Old Testament must be a different God than the God of Jesus. Or, to put it yet another way, the God of the Jews is not the God of the Christians. This was his fundamental framework. You might call it an antithesis between the old and the new. Now, right when you say that, you realize, wow, that sounds a lot like Gnosticism, right? Don't the Valentinian Gnostics, in particular, say that the God of the Old Testament is a different God who emanated out from the main God and built this? Yes, there's a lot of similarities here. And for that reason, there's been speculation for generations about whether Marcion was a Gnostic, okay? The general consensus now is that he was not, okay? Does he share this one thing in common with Gnostics? Yes. But there's a lot of things missing from Marcion that would be considered Gnostic that aren't here. And one of the main things missing is that Marcion doesn't have that elaborate creation myth that the Valentinians did about some emanation from God who creates this world. Now, all he's saying is that the God of the Old Testament and the God of Jesus aren't the same things. Now, pausing on that for a moment, someone today could sound a lot like Marcion when they read the Old and the New. I mean, honestly, people in our churches sort of have the reaction sometimes that Marcion has. Is, look, I'm bothered by this Old Testament stuff. Jesus seems fine, but this Old Testament stuff's kind of concerning, and they end up pitting the Old and the New against each other, okay? This is not a unusual phenomenon even today. And so Marcion tapped into that, into his theology. So, what did Marcion then draw from this antithesis? Well, we're going to just sort of observe three things here that he drew out. First of all, he rejected the authority of the Old Testament. This, of course, is an obvious thing from his contrast. By the way, Marcion wrote a book called The Antitheses that we don't have. And no doubt that's a place that he would probably describe all his objections to the way the new and the old relate. It would be great if we had that book, but we don't possess it. So, first view among the Marcionites, or Marcion himself, is that the Old Testament is not authoritative for believers. An inferior deity produced it, or it's produced about an inferior deity, if you want to look at it that way. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't think the Old Testament was authentic in its own way. He believes it does contain the words of God. He just thinks it contains the words of a different God. So Marcion is not arguing that the Old Testament was forged or faked or anything like that. He's just saying, yeah, it's legit, I guess. It's just the legit version of a wrong God. Different God, not the God of Jesus. So Marcion engages in some scathing criticisms of the Old Testament. He argues that it was incoherent, contradictory, at odds with the new, on, etc. And a lot of these things are repeated by later writers. Marcion was a literalist in his hermeneutic, and so he would read the New Testament literally, and in many ways that was good, but then he just felt like he couldn't get around certain things. Now, some of the New Testament writers, or Christian, Orthodox Christian writers, sort of allegorized the Old Testament in this era. And for that reason, they were able to avoid some of the stress that Marcion felt. So Marcion ended up saying, look, Old Testament God, not our God. Therefore, the Old Testament is not our book. Now, needless to say, that first tenet's enough to sink you in early Christianity. First of all, you believe in multiple gods. It's a big problem in a monotheistic system, okay? So you don't even need to go to his other views before you already realize that his heresy is going to be well established here. If someone tries to join your church and says, hey, I believe in Jesus, I'm a Christian, I think he saved me from my sins, you're like, hey, this sounds great, this guy's a real Christian. And then you dig a little deeper, and the guy's like, oh, by the way, I think the Old Testament God's a different God, and I reject the Old Testament. You'd be like, hold on a second, what? And you believe in multiple gods, you're not a monotheist? Yeah, that's A. And then B, you reject the Old Testament? Okay, that would have sunk him. And it did, basically, in early Christianity. This is one of the major things that was a problem during this time period. Now, there's a second thing that ended up happening with Marcion, is that he, as a result of this, embraced Paul. Now, on the front end, you're going to be thinking, what? Paul loved the Old Testament. How in the world did Marcion embrace the Apostle Paul when the Apostle Paul seems to love the Old Testament? Well, Marcion was sort of selective in his readings of Paul. And as we'll see in a moment, he very much took what he liked from Paul and not other things. But in his mind, Paul got it. And if you think about it, a surface reading of Paul would put you there. I mean, think about the book of Galatians. When you read the book of Galatians, Paul seems pretty negative about the law. Okay? The law is a taskmaster. The law can't save. The law, in one sense, puts you in shackles and buries you. The law is not the solution. The solution is Jesus. And so here's what Marcion saw in Paul. Marcion saw Paul as sort of anti-law, okay? It's sort of Paul doing an antithesis between the law and Jesus. So this would be one of the major driving factors in his writing. And as we'll see in a moment when we get to the canon part, this is why Marcion's canon included only Paul's letters, and an edited version of it at that. So Marcion isn't interested in other New Testament writers. Paul is his guy because he thinks Paul gets this contrast between the old and the new. And, again, admittedly on a first glance, you could see why you might end up going down that particular path. Thirdly, this is interesting, Marcion denied the humanity of Jesus, and as did his followers. So he's just piling on problem after problem here. If, in fact, the physical world was created by the Old Testament God, then he saw the physical world as a problem. And so in one sense, this is another thing that was similar between Marcion and Gnosticism. So according to Marcion, Jesus did not take on flesh and blood. That would make Jesus beholden to the other God. Jesus came from another world and therefore wasn't going to become part of this one in the way that would bind him and restrict him. So once again, Jesus only seemed to be human. And so basically Marcion was a Docetist. Okay? We already talked about Docetism. Docetism, basically the idea that Jesus only appeared to be or seemed to be divine in some, or seemed to be human, in some measure. And this is a very interesting fact. One of the things about Marcion's view here about the incarnation is particularly curious, and we don't know this for sure because it's hard to read between the lines, but it seems that Marcion believed Jesus showed up on earth as a full-grown man. There was no birth of Jesus. And you can see why. I mean, if you think that Jesus isn't really physical, then he thinks that Jesus got imported here and dropped down here as a full-grown adult. He appeared on earth for the first time as a man, not physically a man, but looked like a man, as a full-grown man for the first time. So he would have been Docetic in his theology. Now, you can see there's a lot of overlap here with Gnosticism, but not ultimately. I could probably add a fourth feature, if we wanted to here. You could probably talk about his asceticism. Marcion was an ascetic. He was a strict person who, his followers particularly, would reject anything fleshly in their minds. So they were known for fasting, strict dietary regulations, no marriage, and even if they did marry, no sexual activity. This is a very common factor among second century Christianity, particularly amongst Gnostics, so there's some similarities yet again. So Marcion promoted these ideas. These were his views. These four things were sort of his thing. So what happened to Marcion? Well, obviously his views are rejected. The church in Rome gave him his money back. You got to give him credit there. No doubt Christianity was not a wealthy movement, and they probably needed that money. And they said, we care about truth more than money. They gave him his money back, and he was ultimately kicked out. But don't think for a moment that ended the run of the Marcionites. The Marcionites were very influential in early Christianity. And there was Marcionite churches that sprung up all over the place as a result. It's interesting, Justin Martyr complains about Marcion. He says this, Marcion has caused many of every nation to speak blasphemies and to deny that God is the maker of this universe. So he seems to think it's spread around quite a bit. Tertullian made a famous statement that Marcion's heresies had, quote, filled the whole world. Now, these are rhetorical statements, of course, and people are just commenting about how problematic it is. There's no indication that it literally covered the whole world, of course. But nonetheless, Marcionites were a problem. Now, that leads us to his canon. If you understand Marcion, and now you understand his canon, his theology, he ended up with his own canon, and here's what it was. It was the epistles of Paul and the Gospel of Luke, both edited. So he had one gospel in Paul's letters. And he worked hard to take out as much Jewish, Old Testament-esque stuff as he could from them, although he was pretty inconsistent about this. So he put forward his own sort of truncated, stripped-down canon. Why do you think he picked Luke? Kind of obvious, I guess, but...
His association with Paul?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's pretty interesting. I mean, I think you could argue that he was seen as Paul's companion. Therefore, if you like Paul, you like Luke. You could go that route. It's the only gospel that's not written by a Jew, right? It's a Gentile. And when you read Luke, it has a lot more of a Gentile feel to it. So you can see here that this is why Marcion is given all kinds of names in people's minds. Marcion is viewed as anti-Semitic, okay? So he's kind of like a Nazi, right? He's anything Jewish, get rid of it kind of thing. Now, that's probably not a fair caricature because there wasn't the same sort of structure in his thinking there, but he definitely wanted to avoid the Old Testament. So he ended up having this edited version of Luke and of Paul. Now, because Marcion put forward his own canon, there's been a theory in canonical studies that I don't really cover much in my book, although I might mention it at some point, is there's a theory that Marcion actually ended up creating the idea of canon. That it was actually Marcion who gets the credit for the first canon. And so the argument goes, the Christian church is skipping along just fine without a canon, no problems. This heretic Marcion comes along and puts forward a canon, and the church panics and says, wow, we need to do something to refute this heresy. So they put their own canon forward as a counter-canon to Marcion's canon, okay? As a reactionary canon to sort of rebuttal Marcion's canon. So while Marcion puts forward a limited canon, what's the church do? Puts forward a full canon. So Marcion puts forward Luke, the church puts forward Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is the argument. This was made famous by a guy by the name of Adolf von Harnack. Harnack's thesis, this is the thesis that looms over him. His thesis is that Marcion's canon was the impetus for our canon. And so our canon is simply a reaction. The church didn't necessarily want one. The church wasn't necessarily thinking of one. The church just simply felt like their hand was forced in this particular situation, and the church therefore came up with its own canon. Now, just so you know, in the history of scholarship, this is now not seen as a persuasive thesis. There's a few people who still hold Harnack's view that Marcion created a canon, but for the most part, this has been overturned, and everyone now recognizes that Marcion might have accelerated it. Marcion may have had some influence on it, but the consensus now is that Marcion didn't create a canon, Marcion reacted to a canon. In other words, the idea now is that Marcion took an existing canon that was bigger and shrunk it. He got out the knife and cut it down. So it's not that the church added, it's that Marcion took away. Okay, and those are two very different approaches to the evidence here. Now, I agree with the new consensus on this. I don't think Marcion had really any influence on the canon that's meaningful. I think he was a heretical guy who had a lot of impact in that sense, but I think the canon was already in place before Marcion did his thing. And therefore, if anything, Marcion may have scooted it along, but it was well underway before Marcion ended up doing what he did. Now, one other thing that's interesting here is this is happening around 140, okay? You may not realize it, but we actually, to some extent, have access to what Marcion's Luke looked like. How do we know? Because we have church fathers who wrote rebuttals to Marcion. Okay? And one of the main ones who did that was a church father by the name of Tertullian. Tertullian wrote a very famous work called Against Marcion. And you know what Tertullian did? He actually quotes extensively from Marcion's Gospel of Luke, Marcion's edited Gospel of Luke, and refutes his changes and so on along the way. What that means then is if you put a lot of work into it, you can actually reassemble what Marcion's Luke would have looked like around the year 140, if you can do it through the citations in Tertullian. Now, why do you think that would be important to us? Why would it be good to have at least Marcion's version of Luke around 140 AD? It would just reconfirms an earlier date for Luke. Okay, could do that. What else would it? How else would that help us? If someone said, "Hey, I can give you access to the text of Luke in 140," would you be interested? Why? I don't have a manuscript of Luke from 140. We don't have hardly anything from that era. In fact, the only thing we have in that era is probably that little snippet of John around 125. In other words, that would be the earliest gospel text we have of any significant size. So here's a little background. When I first arrived at Edinburgh, that was going to be my thesis idea. I was going to reconstruct Marcion's Luke as part of my exploration of canon. Now, it didn't take much research to realize that that was going to take me about 20 years. And the reason is because you've got to deal with so many layers of complexity in that I ended up going a different route. But I actually suggested that idea to a later student of mine by the name of Dieter Roth. You guys probably don't know Dieter, but Dieter was here in the early 2000s, ended up studying also at Edinburgh under Larry Hurtado, and just published in his dissertation, which was on this, on Marcion's Luke, was just published in E.J. Brill, the well-known academic publisher, just came out this last year. And so you might be interested to know that an RTS Charlotte grad, sat right where you're sitting, has now published the definitive work on Marcion's Gospel. And he's reconstructed that Gospel through Tertullian and other patristic sources meticulously. And it's a really impressive piece of work and a really detailed piece of work. Here's the thing that's interesting about this, is that with Dieter's reconstruction now in hand, it confirms what we already kind of knew about Marcion's Luke. Here's a little tidbit for you. Even from prior sources, when we looked at Marcion's Luke, it was clear that Marcion's Luke had already, when he had it in his hand, been harmonized with Matthew and Mark. Now, when I say harmonized, what I mean by that is very micro changes here, but textual variations. What would happen when scribes copied books? Scribes would copy a gospel. You do this. When you think about a gospel story, sometimes you'll harmonize it with the parallel story intuitively without realizing it, right? It's like the story of the rich young ruler. You know that the story of rich young ruler, no actual gospel text uses all the phrases rich young ruler. We, in our head, assemble the three psychologically, but no text includes all three. So what happens when scribes copied Gospels, they would just sort of intuitively harmonize them with what they knew another Gospel had. And they would make little changes here and little changes there. Not a big deal, but you could see how the influence of one Gospel on another Gospel in the scribal tradition, okay? That was happening. But what's interesting is that Marcion's Luke already exhibits scribal harmonization with the other Gospels. In other words, by the time Marcion had his copy of Luke, it was already showing harmonization. Why would that be significant?
Displays fourfold gospel canon.
Why?
I mean, they've got to have something to harmonize with.
No, exactly. You're on the right track. In other words, if in 140 Marcion's Luke was already harmonized with the other Gospels, then that means it must have been circulating with the other Gospels. It must have been associated with the other Gospels, so that scribes long before 140 were already assimilating the Gospels together. What does that tell you? That tells you that before 140 there was already a fourfold Gospel collection, or at least a threefold, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you certainly would include John likely with that, in the early 2nd century, if not late in the 1st, in order for there to be some sort of scribal tradition already forming the harmonization. To say it then another way, what you have in Marcion's Luke is evidence of a fourfold Gospel preceding Marcion's Luke. And if there was a fourfold Gospel preceding Marcion's Luke, what does that tell us about what Marcion was doing? That tells you that he didn't create the canon. that tells you that Marcion reacted to the canon. Here's what I think happened, and most scholars would agree now. Marcion held all these quirky views about the Old Testament, looked at the fourfold gospel, and didn't like what he saw. Didn't like the Jewishness of Matthew, didn't like the Jewishness of John. We probably don't know what he thought about Mark, but ended up saying that Luke was the only one he felt comfortable with. So Marcion got out the knife on the canon, cut it up, and had just Luke. This seems to be the most likely result of what went on in early Christianity. So there's a sense here in which this is very confirmatory to what we've been arguing all along. Remember what we've been arguing all along is that there was a core canon at a very early time. Ironically, this sort of gets us there. Now, you could check out Dieter Roth's Luke work out of, I think it's in our library, but I warn you, that's not easy going. It's very, very technical. It's really complicated because Tertullian's work on Marcion is in Latin. So you have to, he's quoting Marcion in Latin. What Marcion wrote in Greek, you have to back translate into Greek, and it's a rough go. So good luck with that, if that's where you want to go. Okay, so there's my speech on Marcion, a very important figure in the study of the canon. So you got to really know that under this heading of apocryphal, or at least in this instance, a edited Luke. All right, let's talk about the closing of the canon as we hit our last little section here. And this is where we'll sort of draw things to a close, fittingly. So whenever you hear people talk about the New Testament canon, one of the things I hear people say is, when was the canon closed? Now, I just want you to think about that question for a moment. When was the canon closed? Now, it's not a bad question. I mean, you understand what people mean by that. Probably what they really mean by that is, when was their agreement? The problem is that's not what they say. When they say, when is the canon closed? And even scholars use the term closing of the canon, or when's the canon closed? But we would have concerns on our model about that language. Let me explain why. When you say, when is the canon closed, that implies that there was a proactive decision somewhere by the church to, quote-unquote, close the canon. As if that's something the church could do. Or as if that's something the church saw its role as. But we've argued from the beginning that that's not at all what was going on in early Christianity. There doesn't seem to be any official closing of the canon. It's not like someone said finally, okay, we've done this long enough, okay? You know, everyone's been arguing about this. We're going to have a vote. We're going to close this silly thing and be done with this and move on. That never happened. There was no closing of the canon, if by that one means an official declaration of the church to do something like that. So, from one perspective, I understand why someone uses the language closing of the canon, but we would push back against whether that accurately captures the kind of things that were going on in early Christianity. Now, I would add to that another perspective. Another perspective is that we might argue that the canon had always been closed for early Christians. Let me explain what I mean by that. Not only was there no proactive vote to close the canon in the 4th century, but we would argue, based on our model, that there was a in principle sense in which the canon had been closed from the start. And here's what that means. That means that even in the 2nd century, in the minds of the Christians, the canon was already restricted to books that were apostolic, which had already been written, which had already been known, most likely, and already been read, and already been, to some extent, received. It's not like it was an ongoing process of writing canonical books, because in their mind, that was over. It was just a matter of recognizing them. Thus, what we're saying here is that the long process of the church recognizing books didn't close anything, as much as simply acknowledge what had always been there. In the minds of the early church, then, what were they thinking they were doing? They weren't thinking they were closing a canon. They think they were recognizing a canon that had in principle been closed at the end of the apostolic time period. There was no more books that could come. The books were settled. God had given them. That part was over. They just simply had to recognize them. Now, I suppose you could say the closing only has to do with the process of recognition. Okay, but there's a sense, though, is that the word closing gives a more proactive sense to things here. I've already mentioned this with the Shepherd of Hermas. The Shepherd of Hermas, remember, was rejected by the Muratorian canon because it was written in their own time. In other words, from their mind, the canon was closed in principle. If you try to put a new book in, that wasn't an option. So in that sense, even in the 2nd century, the canon wasn't open, if you look at it from that angle. You don't have to wait to the 4th century to get a concept of closed. So I include in your notes this quote by Herman Ridderbos from the book Redemptive History in the New Testament Scriptures. And this is the book that I used to use in here. It's a good little book, but it just wasn't very long. It wasn't really adequate for all that we needed, which is why I wrote Canon Revisited. But it's still a very good book. And I want you to look at that quote there, because I think that's helpful. He says this: when understood in terms of the history of redemption, the canon cannot be open. In principle, it must be closed. In other words, it's not an act of the church. It just is closed. That follows directly from the unique and exclusive nature of the power the apostles received from Christ and for the commission he gave them to be witnesses to what they had seen and heard of the salvation he had brought. The result of this power and commission is the foundation of the church and the creation of the canon, and therefore these are naturally unrepeatable and exclusive in character. So when someone gives the impression that Christianity was this wide open affair and that it was kind of like a book contest where everyone's kind of submitting literature that might make it in, that is completely a misleading perspective here. And Ritterboss fixes that by reminding us, no, the canon has been closed in principle, almost from the very beginning, even if there was an ongoing discussion of recognizing the books that were in that closed canon. Here's what that means. That means very early in Christianity, there was already a sense of limiting and restricting the canon. There's already a sense that the canon was restricted and limited. It wasn't open. I mean, think about it with me for a moment. When someone says the canon was open in, let's say, the 3rd century, what does that mean? Think about it this way. If someone says the canon was closed in the 4th, that must have meant it was open in the 3rd. But what does that mean? If you were to go up to a Christian in the 3rd century and goes, hey, I hear your canon's open, what would that mean? Would that mean you could make a new submission? Does that mean that they were open to new books? What does it mean when it says it was open? What they really mean is there's no consensus. Okay, fair enough. But the terms open and closed are just misleading there. It makes it sound like, hey, it's open. We're not shut yet. Give us your best shot. If your book might be good enough, we might include it. It gives this impression that this was totally an open affair when that's not at all what was going on. So I'm going to look at a few examples of this limiting theme in early Christianity. And the purpose of these examples is to show that long before the 4th century, there was an impression that it wasn't open. So let's just look at a few of these examples. First, Dionysius of Corinth. Now, Dionysius of Corinth was a bishop of Corinth around about the time of Irenaeus, really, 170, 180. What's interesting is that as he writes letters, he actually goes out of his way to make sure that no one confuses what he's doing with what he calls the Scriptures of the Lord. Why does he want to make sure there's a distinction between his letters and the letters that make up the, quote, Scriptures of the Lord? Why? Because he doesn't want anyone to think he's writing new canonical books. In fact, he was so concerned about this, he hesitated to write at all. Because he didn't want to make anyone think that he could possibly add to these things, because they were, in his mind, already closed. No new letters could possibly be in this canon, even from a bishop. I think what's particularly interesting about Dionysius of Corinth is this phrase, Scriptures of the Lord. He clearly means in the context, and again, we're not having a chance to go through all these original sources, but in the context this means not God Lord, but Jesus Lord, Scriptures of Jesus. It's Christian Scriptures. I want you to think what was in Dionysius' mind. In his mind, there was a set body of writings that he could refer to as the Scriptures of the Lord. And he assumed that his audience knew what these were. And he made it clear that he wasn't the kind of person that could ever add to or modify or change those with his own writings. That implies a closedness, and it implies a restriction. It implies an assumption that this is something that we acknowledge is already true. We have Scriptures of the Lord even now, and you can't possibly add to them. That does not sound like an open canon. Let's look at a second example, Irenaeus. Here's where we return to the point we made a couple days ago about Irenaeus' perspective on the 4 Gospels. What does he say about them? Again, he says this: it's not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer than the number they are. Now, what if someone went up to Irenaeus and said, hey, I heard the canon is open. And what if they were even more specific about the Gospel? I heard the Gospel canon is open. It's only the 2nd century, right? I mean, Gospel canon must have been open until the 4th century. So Irenaeus, is the Gospel canon open? He would have been like, open? What are you talking about? There's 4 and only 4. There can't be more than 4. Can't be less than 4. There's 4. In other words, in Irenaeus' mind, it doesn't sound like an open canon. Third example, an anonymous critic of Montanism. I know that sounds strange, but let me explain what's going on here. Eusebius, the church historian we used to talk about, he cites a lot of people in his lengthy ecclesiastical history. And sometimes he cites people who doesn't tell you who they are. One time he cites this guy who's critical of Montanism, which is a heresy in early Christianity. We don't know who this anti-Montanist writer is, but it's a little bit irrelevant to the point because this anti-Montanist writer tells us something very interesting about the canon. This anti-Montanist writer is thinking about producing a work against Montanism. In other words, he's thinking about writing a document attacking the Montanists, which would have been a good thing to do. But he hesitates. Why does he hesitate? Here's what he says. I'm quoting. He hesitates because, quote, not from any lack of an ability to refute the lie. In other words, I could do it. I have the ability to refute this lie of Montanism. I'm not hesitating to write from any lack of an ability to refute the lie, but from timidity and scruples, lest I might seem to some to be adding to the writings and injunctions of the word of the new covenant of the gospel, to which no one can add and from which he cannot take away. Now, retrospectively, I probably should just put this quote in your notes, but you don't have to memorize the whole thing. But I'm just going to read it again. I want you to get the impression, not the words, okay? Here's what he says. I didn't refuse to write for any lack of ability to refute the lie, but from timidity and scruples, lest I might seem to some to be adding to the writings or injunctions of the word of the new covenant of the gospel, to which no one can add or take away. Okay, what's interesting about this is that in his mind, there is a canon. That's the first thing to know. Secondly, it's not open, because he can't add to it. He doesn't want anyone to think he's even trying. And thirdly, he actually invokes the neither add to or take away principle here, which is from Deuteronomy 4:2. Now, Deuteronomy 4:2 originally means don't add or take away from the words of a book. But notice what this particular writer is doing. He's applying that to the canon as a whole. You can't add or take away to the canon. The word of the new covenant. If someone were to read this text and think that there's any concept of an open canon here, this does not look like an open canon. This looks like, in his mind, it's shut down, closed. You can't add or take away to this. In fact, I don't even want to write because I'm afraid someone might think I'm trying to do that. Now, this would be particularly important for Montanism, right? Because what were the Montanists doing? Anybody remember what Montanism is? Yeah, like charismatics. And one of the things that the Montanists believe, and this is sort of mid to late 2nd century, they believed they were getting new revelation. And they began to put some of this new revelation in books. And the early church was not happy about this, right? And why were they not happy? Because you can't add or take away from the word of the Lord. To put it another way, this critic of Montanism didn't want to be viewed as making the same mistake as Montanism, which is adding books to the Scripture. Fourth, Gaius. Gaius of Rome around 200 AD had a debate with Montanus himself. And he basically was concerned about their ongoing revelations, which was suggestive of new canonical books. And so he responded by reaffirming the 13-letter collection of Paul. In other words, he rejects Montanism as being able to add to that by saying it's closed, in essence. And this is what he chides the Montanists for doing. He says, quote, he chides them for, quote, recklessness and audacity in composing new scriptures. That's interesting, right? So you guys shouldn't be composing new scriptures. Does that sound like an open canon? Not at all. And then finally, fifthly here, I return to Origen. I hinted at this earlier. But Origen, in his homilies on Joshua, seems to list out all 27 books of the New Testament, which is stunning and early, mid-3rd century. Now, people don't think there's anybody making lists at this time, but Origen makes this list. And what I want you to see here is that he makes this list and doesn't present it at all as if it's new, controversial, or odd, or that there's some debate. He presents it to us in a sermon to his congregation. And his congregation seems to be like, oh, fair enough, those are the books that we know too. There doesn't seem to be any oddity about this. And for more detail on my Origen list, I I turn you back to my website to see the reference to the book where this occurs, if you want to read about that. Where's all this lead us? Simply this, is that the idea of open and closed simply doesn't work in the normal way that people say it is. So what do we mean by closed then, if we even use the term? I don't even like the term closed, because that implies an act of the church. The church doesn't have any authority to do that. But if we're going to use the term closed, we would say simply this: the Bible, and in particular the New Testament, is closed by consensus. It's not closed by an act. It's not closed by a vote. It's not closed by a church council. And so here, I'm going to do something probably unexpected. I'm going to quote Bart Ehrman positively. And I agree with him on this. Here's what Ehrman says. Quote, "The canon of the New Testament was ratified by widespread consensus rather than by official proclamation." And he's absolutely right. Now, people will say, what about all those canonical councils in the 4th, 5th century? But you got to realize what those were doing. Those weren't closing the canon. Those weren't even creating a canon. They're simply affirming what was already the case. They were affirming, these are the books we recognize. Didn't say that we're making this true. Didn't say that they wanted it to be true. It was already true in their mind. So, open and closed canon. Well, I just don't like those terms. And I think as we're looking at it here, we have to be very careful to distinguish between what we mean when we talk about things. The church didn't close anything. They simply, over time, by God's providence, led through the Spirit, coalesced around these books. And if you want to call that a closing, fine. But that's the best we can do for closing, because that's all we've got when it comes to that. All right, so where does this leave us? Remember what we're doing here. We're wrapping up the defeater, or corporate reception. We spent 2.5 days on this. What was the defeater? Christianity was too chaotic, too disorganized, too much disagreement. It was only in the 4th century that any agreement was seen. Therefore, you can't really trust it because it was forced, it was late. Therefore, the consensus of the churches mean nothing. That's the defeater. Our defeater was no. One is we expected some disagreement in our model, so disagreement doesn't challenge our model. And secondly, it's not near as crazy as you say. It's actually fairly compelling because there was a core from the beginning, confirmed by the manuscript evidence, and even when we look at all the boundary books and problem books, it doesn't overturn the general point, which is that there was a consensus on these books very, very early.
The preceding program has been brought to you by Reformed Theological Seminary and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.